Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited that you could join us today for On Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. My name is Alex Elliott. I am the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS public programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Jessica Hernandez and Melissa Nelson, and then we will get right to their conversation. Melissa K. Nelson is an ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and Indigenous scholar activist. Her work is dedicated to Indigenous rights and sustainability, biocultural heritage and environmental justice, intercultural solidarity, and the renewal and celebration of community health and cultural arts. She actively advocates for Indigenous people's rights and sustainable lifeways in higher education, nonprofits, and philanthropy, and is particularly passionate about Indigenous food sovereignty at local, regional, and global levels. Melissa served as a professor of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University and is now professor of Indigenous Sustainability at Arizona State University and continues to work with the Cultural Conservancy, which she has led since 1993. Melissa is the editor and a contributor to Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future, and co-editor of and contributor to Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Learning from the Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability. Jessica Hernandez is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to forestry. Her work is grounded in her Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. She currently holds appointments at Sustainable Seattle, City of Seattle's Urban Forestry Commission, and the International Mayan League. She is also the author of Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Melissa and Jessica.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this lovely night to hear this conversation and celebrate really the work of Dr. Jessica Hernandez and her extraordinary new book. So I am so happy to be speaking with you this evening from the ancestral lands of the Salt River Valley of Phoenix, Arizona, the traditional homelands of the Acamel O'odham and Peeposh peoples of the Maricopa Indian community. I honor their ancestors, their contemporary communities, their sovereign nation, and their future generations. So Jessica, I am just so happy to be here with you. If you'd like to introduce yourself further or share us where you're at tonight.
My name is Jessica Hernandez, and I'm calling from the ancestral lands of the Duwamish peoples, also known as Seattle, named after Chief Sealth. I also want to ask for permission from any elders who are present here today to be able to speak in front of them. Thank you for hosting this conversation, and I'm excited to also be in company and share this virtual space with you.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I've just been devouring your book, and you can't really see it, but it's just filled with Post-it notes and questions and comments. And I just really, first of all, thank you for articulating so many profound, important concepts of our time in such a succinct and really easy and not easy to read, because some of the concepts are complex, but anyone can pick it up and read it and understand it. And that's really important as Indigenous scientists and scholars, to make things legible and understandable by anyone. And I'd like to hear a little bit more for our listeners who are not familiar with the Indigenous peoples that you come from, the Zapotec and the Maya Ch'orti. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to say the second word, the Maya Ch'orti. And I loved learning about, your mother's people and your father's people. And again, those of us in North America may not be as familiar with the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. So if you could share a little bit about those rich heritages, that would be lovely.
Yes, thank you for your question. So the Maya Ch'orti people, we have a strong lineage that dates to our ancestors who built the Great Pyramids. Oftentimes when we hear people talk about the Mayan cultures, they kind of talk about us in the past tense because, there is this misconception that the Mayan civilization actually collapsed, but that's not the case. It's just that our people were displaced in different, throughout South Mexico, all the way through Central America. So the Maya Ch'orti people, our nation, we're divided by three borders, the borders of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And through my paternal side, we come from the El Salvador side of the Maya Ch'orti nation. And unfortunately, during the 1980s, starting from the 1960s and it ended in the 1990s, we experienced a genocide that was coined as the Central American Civil War. And the United Nations has called that and labeled that a genocide. But, it's something that people still dismiss from those conversations. So a lot of our people were displaced from our homelands. And, eventually they made it to indigenous lands in the United States or Canada. And through my father's displacement, he was able to meet my mother in her Oaxacan pueblo, the Zapotec nation, which is closer to the coast. And the Zapotec people, we still hold a matriarchal society. We have a third gender called that we known as the muses, who are,
Mm.
born, biologically male, but they also embody the feminine soul.
Mhm.
And there is constant battles to ensure that we can keep our matriarchal society and also our third gender, because as we all know, colonialism, which introduced patriarchy and also homophobia, transphobia, continues to try to infiltrate itself into our nation.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing about that. That's wonderful to hear. And to be descendants of the people who made those incredible pyramids. I love how you talked about even modern physics can't really figure out how, the wisdom and the brilliance and the technology of your ancestral knowledge to build such extraordinary civilizations. So today, are you still very connected to some of those people, or has it been very challenging due to displacement and war and diaspora?
Yeah, we're still connected because unfortunately my parents were the only ones displaced, and that happens because my father was the eldest in his family, and my mother, usually none of her family is displaced. So we still have like a close connection to home, but I do notice that my Chorti environment still hold on to the trauma that my dad carries, especially when there was a genocide that he
Mm,
unfortunately had to experience as a child. So I think that
mm,
I see how my mom carries her relationships when we go back to her lands versus how my father carries his relationships with the environment when we go back to his land, because he becomes more quiet. He's a little bit more kind of like closed off, and it's something that I have experienced. So yes, we still hold on to those relationships, but obviously they are different based on the trauma that our environments carry in that sense.
of course. And I want to ask you a bit more about historical trauma, but later in the conversation. I think the way you address it is really powerful in the book. And I know that you call yourself unabashedly and unapologetically an Indigenous scientist, which I love. And you've really emboldened me. I have science degrees, and I've still carried some of that, like you said, shame, or not shame, but embarrassment or concern that, oh, I'm not a real scientist because I don't do statistical analysis or all this quantitative data crunching that we think of with physicists or mathematicians or even ecologists who do a lot of modeling now and a lot of quantitative work. So I want to hear you share what it means to you to be a proud, unapologetic Indigenous scientist, and how that differs or is similar to some of the identities of the Western scientists that you work with.
Yeah, so I think it's an experience that we both share, right? That we were, trained educationally in the Western sciences. And I think that, oftentimes when we talk about indigenous knowledge systems, people in the environmental discourse and the environmental sciences refer to it as traditional ecological knowledge. And there are people in our communities who still use that term. But personally, I prefer to use indigenous science just because scientists tend to kind of fixate themselves on the traditional aspect, and they continue to speak about our people in the past tense while
Mhm.
forgetting that our knowledges are currently adapting, especially due to climate change impacts, especially to the displacement that, the majority of indigenous peoples we had to face, whether it was internal, within the borders, or
That's
external, like
right.
outside of the borders. And I think that being trained in those Western sciences has allowed me to understand that the knowledges that we are holding and still continue to hold as Indigenous peoples are very similar to the sciences because they adapt. We have years of observations that don't necessarily translate to that numerical data that you were mentioning, the statistics, but it's knowledge that can help heal our planet. And we have also seen how a lot of our Indigenous science has also been co opted by scientists. A great example that I like to give is permaculture, right? That was science
Mhm.
from the Aborigine people in Australia that, Bill Mollison, if that's his name, I don't remember.
Yes,
He coined
yes.
it as permaculture, and he is considered the founder.
Popularized it.
Yes.
Mhm.
So I think that,
Mhm.
for me, I see it more as a science, but not to negate that, there are people in our communities who refer to it as indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, but just being trained or having that scientific lens allows me to realize that it's a science in itself as well.
Yes, absolutely. No, I completely agree. And, I've been very much inspired by the work of Greg Cajete, which I'm sure you have too. And his great book, Native Science, really outlines we cover almost everything in the scientific method, except that ongoing validation, even though we validate it in our way. It's not validated in the Western Eurocentric way of validating knowledge, but our knowledge is validated every time, we go in and gather foods in the way that we have, or hunt a buffalo the way that our ancestors did, or for you gathered, grew corn and took care of the milpas. So that's a confirmation and a validation of our knowledge every time we have a new generation of people to continue to have that relationship with our food. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And one of the biggest distinctions that Cajete makes about Western science and Indigenous science is what he calls the metaphoric mind, and that Western science is so based on the rational mind or the logical mind and really dismisses dreams and stories and language and poetry and dance and chanting and all those things that are considered culture. And so the title of your book, Fresh Banana Leaves, is certainly a metaphor. I mean, it's a real powerful story of your father's survivance, but it's more than that too. And throughout the book, you weave in stories about the banana tree and how it's been a survival plant and yet it's not native. And so you grapple with that relationship with that beautiful plant. And if you could just unpack that a little bit for our readers, I think that would be really great.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think that, it's important to acknowledge that, like you mentioned, banana trees are not native to Central America, but they were introduced during the death of our indigenous lands when our indigenous lands were sold in multitudes of acres through land grabs to these international agricultural corporations that introduced the monoculture that we see in the form of plantation. So bananas was one of the crops that was introduced during that process where, our lands were commodified to export, especially outside
Mm,
of our lands. And I think that through banana trees, they have become a staple in our foods. Like when we make our tamales, we consume a lot of plátanos, and it's like become a traditional foods for many of us. And I think that why I decided to name it Fresh Banana Leaves is just based on the story that my father kind of shared with me, where the teaching is that nature protects you as long as you protect nature. So during that story, I have to go back to when he was recruited. He was 11 years old when he was
mm,
recruited by the death squads. Not necessarily the death squads, but the death squads came to his canton, his little pueblo, and they burned down his home because they couldn't find him. They had come and attempted to kind of forcefully to recruit him to the death squads, which is the army side of the rebellion. And he was so angry that the death squads actually burned down his home. Luckily, his parents, his mom and his siblings were not there because his father had passed by then. So he went to the the lands to find the guerrilla. So he joined the guerrilla because I think that during the Central American Civil War, because we had lost a lot of our men, they started recruiting children as young as 11. So he recalls how 3 years passed since he was receiving his training and was forced to fight in the war. So at the age of 14, during that time, his encampment, the guerrilla encampment, was bombarded, and he recalls seeking refuge under a banana tree. And this banana tree was a tree that he used to climb, he used to play with. It was his way of escaping his reality as a child going through those hard times. And through when he saw that attack, he went under this banana tree, and he saw how when the bomb dropped, instead of the bomb igniting, the banana leaves kind of wrapped it in a way that prevented it from igniting. And many people can say, oh, it was just a bomb that was malfunctioned, that wasn't created correctly, but my dad believes that it was the banana tree that saved his life.
Protected him.
Yeah, and it was that relationship that he had built as an innocent child, right? Even though he didn't see himself as a child anymore. Because when I asked him, you were a child? He was like, no, I was an adult. But I was like, wait a minute, you were 11. How is that an adult?
Gosh. Yes.
But that was the premises of why I named it that, because it gave us a fresh start. It's the reason why I'm alive here, speaking to you, and why I was able to write his story and write the book as well.
Beautiful, really powerful story. And I love how you reframe, we both do work in restoration ecology, and the whole idea of, restoring native landscapes, restoring native communities. They obviously go together, what Robin Kimmerer calls biocultural restoration or reciprocal restoration, which is so linked. And it's one of the best ways that we can understand the link between nature and culture, which for Indigenous peoples, you never separated anyway. But for Western ecologists, there's almost like this war on invasive species, which is so ironic because it's usually white settlers talking about a war against French broom or Scotch broom or whatever it may be, and wanting to, eradicate this alien species. And you really relate to that in terms of, again, being displaced and being an immigrant, and also seeing that not all quote invasive or foreign plants are negative, and they're incorporated, like the banana has been so beautifully incorporated into your culture. And so if you could just share any more about really relating to the plant also as like a new immigrant, and what it means to be a good settler as opposed to being an invasive settler.
Yes, I think that you kind of mentioned something, right? That invasive species are often, we are taught to like violently kind of eliminate them from the landscapes, and oftentimes my elders told me and reminded me that invasive species are someone's relatives or their displaced relatives, so we still have to follow our protocol to remove them. We still have to ask for their permission. And I think that that's something that Western science doesn't really understand. And it's unfortunate, right? Because you mentioned a lot of these scientists, they're kind of violently removing their plants, their relatives, because a lot of these plants were introduced from Europe. So a lot of people who have European ancestry, that's their displaced
relative. Their relative,
yes. Yeah. So I think that with restoration, it's not to negate that invasive species actually do have an impact, and sometimes are negative impact in our landscapes. But in the cases, for instance, of banana trees, they have become also a relative while they were displaced. We were able to accept them because they were a food source during the Central American Civil War, because now you can find banana trees anywhere throughout Central America. And I think that when we start to understand the relationships that Indigenous peoples have, where we show that respect even to displaced relatives or displaced plant relatives, it kind of also allows me to kind of see the similarities of when we talk about immigration, right? A lot of the immigration discourse kind of forgets to accept the fact that it's Indigenous peoples from Central America who are being displaced. It's Afro-Indigenous peoples from Haiti, the Caribbean, who are being displaced because of those climate change impacts, coupled with political turmoil, coupled with the ongoing oppression that these settler countries are enacting against Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous peoples. And I think that it's the American value, right? Where, oh, if you're not American, you're an immigrant, you're a legal alien, whatever are the negative connotations. But they forget to realize that we're still indigenous peoples from the Americas, and there weren't any settler borders created until
That's right. Very
nationalism.
recently.
Yeah,
Mhm.
nationalism became a thing and created these borders. I think that I see the parallels of how colonization has also infiltrated or is very present in restoration conservation because of those nuances in the way that we perceive invasive species, or in this case also displaced people.
Wow, so insightful, such great connections. And yeah, I love that you don't pull any punches in terms of really naming, eco-colonialism and settler colonialism and how it's embedded in the academy and Western sciences and in the conservation field. And so much of your work as an Indigenous scientist is to decolonize from that. And just so we're all on the same ground, if you could just define, how you define settler colonialism and eco-colonialism. And before that, I was just very moved too and profoundly influenced by how you defined your understanding of settler colonialism living in 3 different nation states. That was just fascinating. So and really powerful between, the different countries. So if you can share a bit about that would be wonderful.
Yes, thank you. So oftentimes in the United States, right, we see people from Latin America as people of color. So during that positionality, people, who are Latinx or who are considered Hispanic forget to self-reflect on their positionality back in our homelands. So, it's kind of like the narrative between the oppressor versus the oppressed, and how the oppressed in this country becomes our oppressors back in our lands. So I think that that kind of shows the bigger picture of what settler colonialism is, especially how it's different because there's a different whiteness or a white identity that's uplifted in each country. So white people from Latin America are considered people of color in the United States.
Yes, right.
And it doesn't say that, it doesn't mean that they don't face any type of oppression, because there is nationalism, there is xenophobia, and the anti-immigration discourse. But it kind of, people forget that their whiteness is something that's oppressing us back in our lands. And I think that navigating through 3 different settler colonialism makes me understand how settler colonialism at the end of the day is uplifting whiteness, and how people who embody that identity don't really self-reflect on their positionality, and it's sometimes they take it personal, right? Like even when we bring up like white supremacy, whiteness, if you're uncomfortable, you are going to kind of be defensive when indigenous peoples or black people or any people of color are mentioning that. And then it kind of gets a little bit more tricky, because you're talking about people of color, or people who are considered people of color in the United States, who are also embodying whiteness when they go back to Latin America. And I think that settler colonialism has allowed me to understand that at the end of the day, it's still oppressing black people, it's still oppressing Afro-Indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples whose lands they're occupying. And nobody wants to do anything, right? Because nobody wants to give up their power and privilege, because that's something that makes them comfortable. That's something that has helped them so much. I think that, it's interesting to navigate those 3 layers of settler colonialism, as you mentioned.
Yeah, that's powerful. It's so insightful. And the way that class and gender also intersect with those different identities is really part of the picture. Mhm. And you really, so much of your work does talk about displacement and relocation and diaspora, along with, the profound sense of the deep roots and sense of identity that indigenous peoples have with our ancestral lands. So can you share a little bit about how you personally balance that tension between kind of the longing for homelands living in the diaspora, but also the sense of belonging that you have as an indigenous person, and the way you relate to the lands that you currently live on?
Yes, thank you for your question. I think that kind of reminds me of my grandmother, something that she always told me, where, as the only daughter displaced, because, like I mentioned, only my parents were displaced. She will always tell me that anywhere I walked on that wasn't necessarily our ancestral lands, I was kind of walking into someone's home. And that someone's home are the indigenous peoples and indigenous lands where I'm stepping on. And I think that through that, she taught me that I had to build relationships, not just with the indigenous lands, which sometimes in land acknowledgements, we tend to focus more on the land aspect, but we forget to focus on the relationship aspect that we should also build with indigenous peoples who are still alive, who are still, you know, trying to steward their lands, even though, you know, management policies, laws, regulations prevent them from doing so.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, through that, she always taught me that, you know, I was walking in someone's home as an unwelcome guest, and I had to build those relationships to be welcome into someone's home. And you know, oftentimes I think that, you know, we all want to go back to our lands, but there is the ongoing oppression. There's still the ongoing violence, especially the persecution of indigenous peoples who advocate for our environments and lands, especially in Latin America. And I think that, you know, unless we can undo settler colonialism that is impacting us negatively, many of us in the diaspora won't be able to return back to our lands.
So true, so true. And I was very fortunate to work with the Tibetan community living in diaspora in the San Francisco Bay Area, who were considered, you know, refugees, immigrants, and didn't have citizenship. And many of them were second, third generation living in refugee camps in India, had never even been to Tibet. Their parents or grandparents had to flee for their lives in the 50s. And yet, you know, their languages, their songs, their Losar, they just celebrated their new year with the new moon. The way that they kept their culture alive and praying to their sacred mountains and to their sacred deities through their foods and their languages and stories was just so inspiring to me, that they've never been to their homeland. They probably will never go to their homeland. And yet they have that deep bond, which really gets to that spiritual essence of our relationship to our lands. It really transcends physical space. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, you know, the Tibetan people are also a great example, right? Because they cannot return back to their homelands because it's still being, you know, there's still colonialism going where people are trying to take over their lands. And, you know, as a result, they're being persecuted and they had to seek refuge in India and obviously in other parts of the world as well.
That's right. That's right. Yes. And your beautiful subtitle to, you know, healing Indigenous landscapes through Indigenous sciences. As Indigenous peoples, I think that's just medicine to our ears. We're like, yes, you know, say it. It's on a book, you know, it's on podcasts, it's on the radio. You're really getting that message out there. And yet, I think for many non-Indigenous peoples, there may not be an understanding of really exactly what that means. So if you could just say a little bit more about your definition of healing Indigenous landscapes.
Yeah, so I often feel that non-Indigenous peoples think that I wrote a guidebook on how to heal Indigenous lands through Indigenous science. And I think that that kind of loses, you know, kind of goes against the message that I was trying to make, where we have to center Indigenous peoples of the lands that we're currently occupying, settled in, or currently living, so that we can heal our landscapes. And obviously, you know, I'm not going to be sharing sacred knowledge because oftentimes people don't understand that some Indigenous science is sacred knowledge that our cultural protocols do not allow us to share unless we have permission. And I think that that kind of manifests itself in the fact that a lot of our Indigenous science that has been shared has been co-opted or published without, you know, our permission. And I think that one of my main areas is that as Indigenous peoples, we still carry trauma, but we also carry the healing because, you know, we're not sitting in a corner, not being able to do anything because otherwise our cultures wouldn't have survived colonization. We're still thriving, we're still adapting. And genocide doesn't really necessarily define our cultures or communities, but it's something that's still embedded in our history, yet it's ignored, right? Especially in mainstream educational discourses. And through that, I'm just putting the message that we had to center ourselves, especially our spirituality, because that's the core of our Indigenous science, our spirituality, where unlike Western sciences, we're told that in the name of objectivity, we have to remove ourselves from the science. But through Indigenous science, we are told to put ourselves forward because we are a part of nature. Nature is not a part of us, right? Because our creation stories always kind of, you know, are rooted in the fact that the creator created us from our environment. And I think that that is like something that I see people finding as a blur line, because they thought that, or they think the book is going to be a guidebook on how to, heal indigenous landscapes, which, one book cannot do. And it's a call for us to center and uplift all these indigenous communities globally as well.
Yes, I love that. And it really speaks to what Enrique Simon says, is that all indigenous knowledge is local knowledge. All indigenous knowledge is local knowledge, not meaning that it can't be useful or important in terms of understanding transnationally, with indigenous solidarity movements globally. But, what's a Zapotec science is going to be for your Zapotec homeland, and an Anishinaabe science is going to be for my homeland, and Ohlone science is for the Ohlone people. And I think that's really a challenge for the Western Eurocentric mindset that is always looking for universal knowledge, right? Something that supposedly can be utilized anywhere in the world. Why do you think it is that, Western Academy and Western science is so, I would say, almost obsessed with this idea of, quote, objective universal knowledge, whereas indigenous peoples are so comfortable with the idea that, my sacred mountain is right here, but your sacred mountain is right there, and there's no problem, right? That's the center of your universe. This is the center of my universe. And that's okay. And that seems to be a fundamental schism between indigenous knowledge systems and, for lack of better words, Western or Eurocentric worldviews.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I think that it just reminds me of what I'm currently doing in environmental physics, right? Where physics has separated itself from any societal impacts, from any societal implications, where, it's not social political. It doesn't really have any justice components to it, because, it's this abstract concept where nothing intersects with society, which is not the case, right? We think of physics, we think of the concept of energy, and how that's a core term and concept that's taught in physics education. And we know that energy industry is kind of resulting in a lot of climate change impacts, but yet physics continues to separate the concept of energy from society, where the concept of energy is something that cannot be perceived or seen. And we know that that's not the case. And I think that I disagree that Western science is objective, because when we look at the history, it comes from European white cisgender men who had
Yes.
philosophical views, where religion was also Western Christianity
Religion was
also
very involved.
yeah. So I'm like, for me, it's not objective, but I guess because it's a dominant culture, it's a dominant norm, it seems to be objective, right? But I don't think it is.
Yes, no, I don't either. I don't either. And I love Vandana Shiva's great work, Monocultures of the Mind, where she really deconstructs that idea that Western European science is a local knowledge from a little island in Northern Europe, right? And a couple little islands there, and it's not a universal knowledge, but we think it's universal knowledge because it was spread through cognitive imperialism. So it's kind of like this trick that we've all have believed, but indigenous people, I don't think, ever did. And so that's an important, cognitive difference that I think really creates a division and a tough place in academia. And I loved how your book asked your elders questions, your family members questions, and then you asked yourself questions. And there was something about, how every day, like, how hard is it for you to work in academia, and what are some of the challenges or obstacles that you face? We know that, in your book, you talked about your father's really tragic story of having to go to war at such a young age and being in physical war. And yet you, and a lot of us are kind of word warriors, what Gerald Visner calls word warriors in the academy, right? Fighting for spaces. So what are some of your daily struggles and opportunities in higher education and in science that you're grappling with?
Yeah, sometimes like I think of just the tokenization that happens with a lot of indigenous peoples, especially in the academy, where we are told to speak for all, like you were
Oh,
mentioning before,
yes.
to speak for all indigenous peoples. And oftentimes I'm
Mhm.
like, well, I can only speak for myself. And sometimes I cannot even speak for my entire community, because we
Mhm.
don't we're not all the same. We're not going to all agree on the same concepts or the same themes that I bring up. And I think that that's something that Western society still is trying to address, where you were mentioning also how it's trying to make us all a universal thing where it doesn't necessarily address our intersectionalities, our different identities, how it's place-based, how it's not universal, that it can be applied anywhere, because that's not respecting Indigenous sovereignty in that place. And I think that that's the biggest obstacle I face. I also see it how we continue to be research subjects or areas of expertise, where especially in the environmental sciences, right, you see a lot of non-Indigenous scientists who are like, I'm an expert in Indigenous communities, but you don't see them applying that to other communities. So I think that,
Right.
it's kind of become a commodity where Indigenous cultures and knowledge is something that they can be consumed, especially in the environmental sciences.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as Paulo Freire and so many have said, our Western education, it's a banking model. It's a capitalistic model of education. We buy information, we digest it, we consume it, we deposit it, we extract it. So it's not really a living understanding of learning and knowledge from Indigenous worldviews. And yet we're trying to indigenize the academy in various ways. And I know that you're teaching some really exciting classes that you spoke about last semester. And how are you trying to bring in some of these concepts of Indigenous learning processes in your classroom?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I taught in climate science, and I think that there was that pushback that I received from some students where I was integrating Indigenous voices, why Indigenous science was important, because, as a student, you have normalized that in your introductory Western classes, or, introduction science classes, you're going to just focus on the Western science, how to do the math, how to, find the calculations, especially in climate science. So I think that by me providing lived experiences, case studies, that we're seeing how climate science is not necessarily just focusing on the physics models that are, basically putting the data for our greenhouse emissions, but it's also focusing on the people, the experiences that they're having as a result of climate change, how it's Indigenous communities who are being impacted by climate change impacts, and how that's often ignored in climate science, where we focus more on greenhouse gases, where we focus more on blaming the agricultural systems, which, I mean, they're responsible, but it's still kind of forgetting to look at the bigger picture, how we are, seeing activism kind of be put in the front and center, but it's not really centering Indigenous peoples who are currently experiencing climate change impacts. Even looking at the Pacific Islanders, there's a lot of Indigenous peoples whose islands, are kind of being lost because of sea level rise. Yet when we look at climate justice and the activism that has built momentum, they're nowhere to be included or, uplifted or found. So I think that through that, students were received something different, but because it was something different, I did receive like some receptive students who were like, wait a minute, why is this, being talked about in this class? How is this related? But I think that, if we're not always going to get to all the students, but if we can get to some students who, are like, thank you for, telling me this. I was able to bring up how Indigenous peoples continue to be forgotten in this class. It's like, it kind of builds those seeds and plants those seeds, and hopefully they will build into, trees or flowers. But obviously, it's not always going to be the case, especially students who are coming in from that Western science lens.
Exactly, and are not really prepared for self-reflection and a different way of understanding knowledge. Yeah, I've struggled with some of that as well. And in Western education, we think we have a right to knowledge, and in Indigenous education, we have responsibilities to knowledge. And so it's a very different approach. And we roll up our sleeves and like do stuff with our knowledge. And I've been really impressed to see how you've really immersed yourself in the Puget Sound, the Salish Sea with the Duwamish and all the incredible tribes, proud tribes of the Seattle area. And, the climate change issues are very, very poignant there because of sea level rise and the salmon fishing. And have you been doing some restoration work in the Puget Sound there, or supporting some of the tribes and some of their environmental justice issues?
Yes, definitely, especially in Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center. That's where I had kind of did my project for my dissertation, where the community
Mhm.
told me what they needed from the environment, as opposed to me, like you were saying, how as scientists we're trained to make up the question or kind of tell the community what would be beneficial for them without
Mhm.
including their knowledge. And I think that there's a soil project that I'm hopefully, going to start doing in South Seattle, and working with the Black and Indigenous solidarity that hopefully, flourishes into something across, nationally to kind of empower our communities, especially seeing how settler colonialism is intersected in both of our histories.
Absolutely. And I love how in your book too, you talk about urban indigeneity. And that's something I also focus on in the San Francisco and Oakland Bay Area, and also now here in the Phoenix Valley. And 70% of Native Americans live in urban areas, and then indigenous communities living in diaspora from India, Tibetans, and Maya from all over the place, and Mosquito from Nicaragua. And so really urban areas have become these beautiful multi-ethnic indigenous hotbeds of solidarity and activism and justice issues. And not that we're not without issues, because we're all at different levels, like you said, of colonization and decolonization and settler status. But it's very exciting to recognize indigeneity in urban areas. And I really love that you uplifted that in your book. Can you say a little bit more about your work and the importance of honoring indigeneity in urban spaces?
Thank you for your question. And I think that it goes back to that statistic that you mentioned, right? That 70% of indigenous peoples live in urban areas. And I think that that has a lot to do with the opportunities that are offered back in our homelands. That's more of the internal displacement that continues to happen in this nation, settler state, the United States. And I think that, sometimes we even forget how urban areas are still indigenous lands. They just have
Yes.
undergone a lot of that eco-colonialism, right? That changes to their environments through urbanization, through, tech, companies.
Technology.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think that it's important for us to honor those as well and see how our knowledges, like we were both discussing, may are being like taken and brought to the urban settings where we're not losing the indigeneity like many people might believe, because we're no longer living in our ancestral lands.
And yet we're in being enriched by learning from each other. We have the Cultural Conservancy has a farm just outside of San Francisco, and we have Mayan farmers come and teach about their corn and tell their stories of corn. We have Seneca corn farmers talk about their relationship with a different variety of corn from the North Country. We have Yaqui people talk about their relationship with certain beans, and then Navajo talk about their beans. So it's almost like a new type of indigenous internationalism in urban areas. And I think it's very enriching and showing that we are modern people and not just in the past. And we're adapting always and evolving. Yeah, excellent.
Really.
Yeah. And I love you did a whole chapter on ecofeminism and really uplifting, the women leaders of the Zapatista movement that was so powerful and such a watershed movement for Indigenous rights globally. And if you could just, share a little bit more about how you define ecofeminism, and especially Indigenous women's role as environmental land steward.
Thank you for that question. I think that's something that I always struggle with, especially not necessarily the concept of ecofeminism, but the fact that my Zapotec nation, especially my pueblo, because as a nation we're made up of different pueblos, how we have maintained that matriarchal society where it's the women, who are leading our tables, where every woman has to speak before the men can actually speak, and it's like a small bubble because when you leave, Juchitan, or you leave your pueblo, you're kind of faced with patriarchy where as a woman you have to be quiet, you cannot speak against the men,
Mhm.
especially cisgender men. And I think that through ecofeminism it's kind of like something that I find myself in the gray area because, ecofeminism teaches us that, as women, we have a stronger relationship with nature because of the nature and nurture situation. But yet in my communities, it's a matriarchal society, but then I'm constantly fighting, the patriarchy. And I think that that's something that we all face, and how patriarchy has infiltrated some of our pueblos in our nation, where some of our pueblos are no longer a matriarchal society, and how, this my little pueblo is still trying to fight to prevent that from infiltrating. And I guess with ecofeminism, it kind of uplifts Indigenous women and, women in general, and how it shows how it's our Indigenous women who are leading a lot of our environmental movements, who are leading a lot of our resistance movement. And the Zapatistas is a great example because it was something that Indigenous women led, but because of patriarchy, Comandante Marcos, who was a cisgender man, became the face of that movement, even though he was, being led by these strong Indigenous women. So that's how ecofeminism kind of manifests itself in our communities. But then we see in outside of our community, the patriarchy always continues to give the men the authority and also the reign of the movement.
Exactly. And it's really a remnant of colonialism too, because so many times a lot of Native cultures, not all, but many Native cultures of the Americas really were more matrifocal, matrilineal, women-centered. And when colonialism came in and Christianity, it was always about privileging the men. And of course, whenever you are given a lot of power and privilege, it's hard to give that up. And it becomes a habit or a pattern that has been internalized in a lot of our Indigenous communities, along with homophobia, as you mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of peeling that has to be done. Yeah. And speaking of, I love that. I love all your food metaphors in your book. Peeling the onion of decolonization, and how you share with your students that, the decolonial process, it's kind of an ongoing process, like peeling an onion. Can you share one of those layers of the onion with us?
Yeah, so the ways that I kind of give a because as Indigenous peoples we tend to be more visual, give a visual example to students is like it's peeling an onion, right? Because settler colonialism is not just one layer that we have to dismantle. When we talk about decolonize the academy, is not just doing one thing to decolonize it, it's multiple layers that we have to deconstruct or dismantle in order for us to truly decolonize the academy. And I often like to use the metaphor of peeling onion layers because, there's going to be healing that our communities have to undergo. And there's going to be a lot of crying because, our tears are our healing mechanism, especially from our body. And, that was the metaphor that I came up with because, we always kind of shed tears when we're peeling or, or cutting up
Always,
onions.
yes. When you peel your onions, you're left with your tears. Exactly. And then eventually a tasty meal. But you got to get through some layers of tears, definitely. Yeah. Well, I'd like to read one little section at the end of your book about healing. It's not going to ruin the book for you who haven't read it yet. But it's just such a beautiful, succinct, you have a way to just of articulating complex concepts in these really succinct ways. I just love that. And you say, I strongly believe that in order to start healing Indigenous landscapes, everyone must understand their positionality as either settlers, unwanted guests, or welcomed guests. And that is ultimately determined by the Indigenous communities whose lands you currently reside on or occupy. Yeah. And I think there is a reckoning happening, since 2020 and the racial justice movement with Black Lives Matter and so many converging crises, including the pandemic and the economic crisis and climate change. We're in exciting times. There's tumult, and people are beginning to recognize whose land am I on? And it's so refreshing. I've been doing this work for probably a couple more decades than you. And, when I used to talk about returning native lands to native hands, people would be like, whoa, that's private property. That's sacrosanct. That's, you can't talk about that. And now the land back movement and the land rematriation movement and the environmental justice movement, things are strengthening and building. And would you like to share a story about an environmental justice victory or environmental project you've worked on that you felt worked really well, that was something very successful?
Yeah, so I can just recall the recent Mayan-led environmental movement where the Maya Kekchi community, and it's something that we supported through the International Mayan League, how they were leading a resistance movement, a peaceful resistance movement against a Canadian mining company that was desecrating their lands. You know, our the Maya Kekchi community was met with a lot of violence, especially from the government, where they were using gas, other things to kind of prevent our people. But I really like how the Prensa Comunitaria, which is a Mayan Guatemalan based news outlet, sent to our Indigenous women, where they were showing the Indigenous women stopping the army. And I really like how it was seen, it wasn't patriarchy where, the men were being put in the front and center of these articles. And right now, I haven't looked up the news, but there were actually kind of defending their Indigenous rights in front of Congress and the United Nations. So hopefully we will see how that turns out. But it shows how, because it gathered a lot of media attention, especially outside of Guatemala, it kind of pressured the government to actually be like, oh, wait a minute, maybe we didn't do the best techniques, which often tends to happen, right? Our Indigenous movements, our peoples are met with a lot of violence, but then you see other things like in Canada with the truckers, they're not really being violent against them.
Or other white settlers who occupy public lands and there's no problem. Yeah. But if Indigenous peoples go to quote public lands to, harvest traditional foods or medicines or pray at sacred sites, are often arrested. Yeah. So there's really still gross injustices in that area. Wow, that's a good story to hear from the Mayan people. And there was just recently also a landmark case you probably heard about in Ecuador. The high courts, yes, said that there can be no oil and gas exploration on Indigenous territories without free, prior, and informed consent. And they're actually trying to set up a protocol and a process where it's implemented. It's not just on paper. So everyone's quite hopeful about that legal victory to see how it gets implemented. Yeah, great. And let's close. We just have a few minutes left on food and your work with food sovereignty and urban gardening and some of the foods that you are working with in the Seattle area with some of the local tribes or some of your traditional foods.
Yeah, so one of the projects that I'm trying to continue like co-leading, it's like a mutual aid to support our Indigenous communities back in Oaxaca, especially as extreme weather conditions are destroying almilpas, which is our holistic agricultural system that kind of is a communal harvest. And I think that that's something that I'm still working on, especially whether drought or hurricane season is continuing to destroy our crops. And hopefully with this pandemic, right, food insecurity has been something that has been amplified, unfortunately, with a lot of our community members. And how do we get foods to them is something that it's always in our minds, especially for those of us who, I feel like everyone who does environmental work who's Indigenous ends up doing some food sovereignty.
You have to, exactly. You just have to. Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's so important. That's great to hear. And as I mentioned in your book, in her great book, I can't quite show it here, she asks questions of so many people, really good questions. And there's a couple in here that you actually ask, I think it's in the Eco Wars section. Oops, I thought I highlighted it here, where you ask it of the readers what people can do to basically increase Indigenous justice. Shoot, let me see, where is it here? I lost it. Let's see. Well, you basically talk about how conservation is a Western construct that was really created to exploit indigenous lands and natural resources. And then you kind of challenge the reader to challenge them. What are they going to do to really uplift and recognize the rights of indigenous peoples in national parks? And I thought that was great that you did that, because national parks are meant to be for all people at all times, and yet they were indigenous peoples' lands for thousands of years, and yet many indigenous peoples were excluded from them. And a lot of people of color historically have not really been invited or welcomed or been able to access a lot of the national parks as well. So I like that you're really trying to decolonize the park model as well. If you can say anything more about that with some of the national parks you've worked with in your home country and in the US.
Yeah, so I think that whole national parks concept is something that manifests from the United States. And, a lot of people don't understand or don't know that national parks can be found now globally, especially throughout the Americas. And I was talking about my Maya Ch'orti lands, which now hosts or houses a national park where, it doesn't necessarily allow indigenous peoples to kind of steward the landscape, or it doesn't allow us to practice our ceremonies or traditions that we used to practice in our lands, right? Especially in our sacred sites. And we see that a lot in the Bay Area, especially in California, where land is something that everyone kind of wants, because everybody wants to move to California because of these major cities. But yet, when it comes to indigenous peoples, they're not even allowed to step foot, or they have to fight to get permission to practice their ceremonies, especially ceremonies are important for them to have in these national parks. And I think the whole concept of national parks and digesting the history is that it was rooted on, the forced removal of indigenous peoples from these lands, that somebody was like, oh, these are beautiful lands, I want to preserve them for the
Mhm.
future generations, without understanding that the beauty behind those lands was because indigenous peoples were successfully stewarding and
That's
caretaking of
right.
those lands.
That's right. Yes, it's the whole deconstruction of the wilderness model, which the environmental movement was completely based on the wilderness model, and this idea of untouched, pristine nature, which was a fallacy because it was very touched, like you said, with the hands of a lot of women and men, elders and young people stewarding those areas, those relationships. And again, I love you include Enrique Simon's great work and discussion about concentric ecology and breaking down that binary of, human dominating nature or nature being alone without humans. We often go from an anthropocentric to a biocentric worldview. The environmental movement did, right? It can't be human centered, has to be nature centered without humans. But then Enrique Simon and Dennis Martinez and others came up with this concept of concentric ecology, that no, we have to center our relationships with all of these relatives as equals and as reciprocal. Yeah. Great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about the book at this point? I know we're going to open it up. I see lots of questions coming in, which is very exciting. I could talk to you all evening about your wonderful work, and that we've been on such parallel paths doing so many exciting things together and on parallel areas. So thank you so much, Chi for your extraordinary book and your incredible work. And all the listeners out there and viewers, check it out if you haven't picked it up yet. Fresh Banana Leaves. It's a wonderful read. It's powerful. It's not always easy, because Dr. Hernandez really talks about, the brutal consequences of colonialism and healing from that, healing as Indigenous people, but the healing that needs to happen with all people due to settler colonialism. So really appreciate that.
And I just want to thank you, Dr. Nelson, because you are a pioneer in Indigenous science, and especially the work that my generation is doing and the future generations are yet to come could not have happened, right, without Indigenous scholars like yourself, like Dr. Kyle White. And I think that it's important for us to acknowledge the fight that the previous generation started and continues to have, so that we can truly liberate our lands and also kind of liberate ourselves in the academic setting. So thank you. And it was an honor to have this conversation, especially, in your presence.
Oh, well, likewise. Thank you. And looking forward to many future collaborations. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And great. Well, we will go to Jason here with some questions. Many have come in for us and Dr. Hernandez. Let's see here. Do you have any thoughts about how organizations working in this space can better elevate Indigenous voices and stories about Indigenous science?
And I also welcome your responses. But I think that
Yeah.
one of the things that I always tell organizations, especially environmental organizations, is to kind of grapple with their history, especially when, like for instance, the Sierra Club is finally dissecting their racist history of their founder, and they're trying to create, more solutions, more just solutions, so that they can, in a way, heal from that, harm that their founder did and their organization as an entity did. So I think that it's important for us to learn Indigenous histories, especially Indigenous lands, the Indigenous histories of the peoples whose lands we're occupying. And also, we are also seeing how, that integration of other histories is also being dismissed, and there's loss fighting, especially in our K through 12 system. So that would be my response. What do you think?
Yes, I think that's those great ideas. I think that it's building relationships with the local people. So many times environmental groups are saying, "What can I do?" or "I don't know anyone." But there's, especially in urban areas and rural areas, you're always on Indigenous lands, whether they're federally recognized or not. Maybe be organized as Native nonprofit organizations or Native American health centers or annual powwows or cultural events, and build relationships with local people of the land. They're still around. They're not invisible. They're back from extinction, as the Mwekma Ohlone like to say, even though they've been so invisible, especially in urban areas. But Native people are always there and present, and are busy, but have real sincere interests into creating relationships with their land again. And they're always fighting justice issues. There's an incinerator, there is a energy plant, even green energy. There's a solar farm going up on desert, and the Chemehuevi and the Mojave are saying that's our sacred land. That's not a wasteland. You can't just cover it with solar panels without talking to us because of historic sites and trails and all kinds of things. So I would look into local environmental justice organizations and also tribal organizations. There's always a way you can volunteer and just educate yourself and learn about the issues and build relationships and build trusts. Go with a good heart, a lot of listening, and offer your services. You may be a web designer, you may be an accountant, you may be a soil scientist. Those are all things that tribal people need to help us with reconnecting and rematriating our lands. So there's many things that you can do. Yeah. All right. Let's see. We've got a bunch of great questions here. Let's see. Oh, well, I'd be curious about your definition of this one. This is a simple but complex question. What makes a person an Indigenous person or a non-Indigenous person?
Yeah, I often get that question a lot, and I think you can probably relate to that. I also get the statement that eventually everyone is Indigenous if you were to trace back your history a lot. And I think that, sometimes that kind of may seem a little bit uncomfortable, especially for Indigenous people, because you're kind of invalidating their
invalidating,
yeah, by
yes.
saying, well, we're all Indigenous. But I don't know if
Yes.
that question is hinting towards that statement. But I think that for me, being in my Ch'orti and Zapotec woman, despite being displaced, is that I still hold relationships and responsibilities to my communities. I still, uphold the languages, the traditions, the ceremonies. I still, visit my ancestral lands. And I know that oftentimes, because of immigration, not everyone has access to that. I still, it's the responsibility and that relationship that I have to uphold, even in the diaspora back with my communities. And for me, it's up to my communities to determine whether I'm Indigenous or who is Indigenous. So I think that kind of ties back to that Indigenous sovereignty that they have, not necessarily something that's written, because, we don't have treaties. It kind of pushes against Black quantum because it's more of a relationship building with the people and the land. I don't know.
Yes.
How you
Oh,
wanna answer.
you did a great job. That was powerful. That was great. You've been getting it asked a lot. I hope that helps answer. Yes, I think the key points that you bring up is that being an Indigenous person means you have many responsibilities and obligations to your lands and your people and your language and your culture and your ancestors and the future descendants. And it's very localized. Again, it's not a universal, and that you're also recognized by your elders. It's not just a personal choice. It's not a personal decision. It really is about your heritage and your belonging and your identity and who claims you. Yeah, that's a big part of it. So thank you. Do you see around you any healthy examples of alliances between Indigenous peoples and settler cultures? If so, what do they look like and what makes them work? Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah.
I cannot think of any examples.
I know.
Do
I
do
can
you
think
have
of a
any?
couple.
Okay.
Yes. So, well, I think there's some really great examples happening in the San Francisco Bay Area with the land rematriation movement and some of the white settlers who are donating back through something called the Shumi tax with the Ch'orti Land Trust, that is a voluntary tax to acknowledge the first peoples of the land for settlers who maybe lived in an area for 3 or 4 generations and maybe paid the county tax or state taxes, but never acknowledged or contributed anything to the first peoples. And so the Shumi tax of Ch'orti Land Trust has been very successful with a lot of settler allies financially contributing, also donating other resources like cars or houses or farm equipment. So it's a little bit more of like a voluntary reparations, but I think that that's an important move. And there's other Native organizations and groups around the country who are adopting this voluntary tax program, and it's working. I think it's a way that white settlers are giving something back and acknowledging their status. Also in Canada, there's a really interesting conservation through reconciliation movement. And likewise, there's a number of white settler communities who are very much uplifting Indigenous-led conservation, much like the end of your book talked about Indigenous-led conservation efforts in tribal parks in Canada. So I think that's another really good example. So it's happening slowly but surely, yes. Let's see, another question from Edgar, somewhat related. Could you talk about the importance of land back to the land restoration movement? It's hard to imagine Indigenous land restoration without Indigenous peoples getting their land back.
Yeah, I definitely agree, right? Because I think that the land back movement kind of entails that Indigenous peoples are going to caretake and steward their lands. They're going to have kind of like a management system where, their Indigenous knowledge, obviously, it's all place-based, is going to be kind of healing those landscapes. And I think that the land back movement is something that's not really talked about in conservation. I think it goes back to a statement you make where land is something that you own, so you don't necessarily want to give it up. I don't know if you have more to add.
Yes, well, again, with that too, there's some exciting examples of, it's usually not the elder generations, they want to pass it on to their kids, but there's, new generations of white settler families who are saying like, wow, how did my grandparents get this land? It was through bloodshed. It was through, slavery. It was through genocide. And it doesn't belong to me. So there's, I think, a new generation of young folks in California I can speak of who are starting to talk about land back and really mean it, giving it back when they can afford to just completely give it back, or, selling it much reduced, or donating back, or opening up access agreements or conservation easements. There's a growing native land trust movement that is pretty exciting, that is part of this land back movement. And some lands were just returned in Mendocino County, actually the county I grew up in, from the Save the Redwoods League on the coast of Mendocino County. Beautiful land back to the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council that was actually the first Native American land trust in the US, and a consortium of California Indian tribes in Mendocino County. So that's a great success story. So yes, Edgar, you're exactly right. Land back and land restoration and Indigenous peoples getting their land back is key. Yeah. Great questions. How would you like to see scientific institutions and, quote, mainstream science change and adopt other ways of thinking and knowing? Whew. Good one. You want to try that one, especially maybe with climate science, since you're doing a lot with that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to, I guess we had to walk a fine line, right? Because adopt can also mean you're co-opting and stealing Indigenous knowledges without kind of uplifting the Indigenous peoples. I think a way to do that is to redefine who we consider experts, especially, we don't necessarily need people with credentials or a PhD to be considered experts. A lot of things that I advocate for is to bring elders and community members from the community, the local Indigenous communities who didn't have the opportunity to go through higher academia or education to kind of speak on their lived experiences. It's also making more space for Indigenous scholars, Indigenous peoples to come into the academy. There's a lot of gatekeeping, right, on who can actually teach climate science, because it's, or, other environmental sciences, because sometimes, like you were mentioning, I think that statement kind of resonated where, sometimes we are told, oh, that you're not really doing science because you're integrating the community. You're not doing the statistical data sets because, you're spending most of your time building those relationships with the community. And I think it's, in a way, redefining how we do science will be another way. But I think that we had to walk a fine line to respect and uplift Indigenous knowledges without co-opting them, or, kind of adopting them in a way where it kind of becomes something that we can consume, but not really do justice by the people who are holding those knowledge or knowledge, wisdom elders and things like that.
Yes. Such an important point you make just now in the book, that Indigenous knowledges do not exist separate from Indigenous peoples, right? And I think, again, the consumeristic mindset of the Western Academy in terms of knowledge that can be bought and sold and extracted, and Indigenous knowledge has been extracted and exploited and commodified, and even tried to be patented. And there's sadly too many examples of that, right, where non-Native folks have exploited Native knowledge and patented things with no benefit going back to the original creators of that knowledge. So it's important to always remember that Indigenous knowledges exist with living Indigenous communities, yes, and to honor their rights and sovereignty. Yeah, really important. What are your thoughts on Indigenous peoples living in local areas having a greater voice and more direct interaction with settler elementary schools and curriculum? Yes.
I'm not sure if I understand that question, but do you understand it? Or?
Yeah, I think she's saying that, basically kind of what you were saying, hiring local indigenous peoples to come and share their stories, the true history of the land, you know, and not whitewashing the history for elementary school children, and, you know, not waiting for fourth grade to just learn about, you know, the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving, or in California, the Spanish mission system and how good they were to the poor little Indians, you know, but actually getting the true history from Native people and helping change curriculum. And I know, again, that's happening in California to shift that fourth grade elementary school education curriculum to tell more of the true history about the complexity of colonization and its negative impacts on Native peoples, rather than whitewashing it all the time. So that's a big hot debate, Shelley. Thank you for bringing that up, you know, because when do people talk about slavery, right? Or World War II and the Holocaust? And, you know, those things are taught in school, but Indigenous genocide is not generally taught in school. And that's part of our jobs as college professors. You know, they get to college and they take an American Indians class. They go, I never learned this. How come I never knew this? And they get angry. Actually, students get really upset that they were not taught the true history when they were younger. So yes, Shelley, you should definitely reach out and have more revised curriculum. I think that's really important. And someone else, Elba asks here, what are other books or articles you would recommend to read to learn more about Indigenous science? Great question. You can start with your lists. I'm sure we have a similar list. It's not a huge body of literature yet. It's in the minds and hearts of our elders.
Yeah, that is true, right? Because not our elders never think of, you know,
Writing
publishing or
things
writing.
down.
Yeah, because that's not our ways of being. But you know,
Yeah.
I would like to also uplift your books, right? And if you want to talk more about them, and also Dr. Carl's White
Yes.
literature, Dr. Sandy Grande.
Mhm.
There's so many books out there. Dr. Max Liveron. Who else
Mhm.
can I think of? I should have a written list, because I'm always
Yeah,
asked
we
this
can.
question and I
I
forget.
know. Let's do that. Let's come up with a list, and CIIS public programs can put it up afterwards. But yes, all of those folks are incredible. Enrique Samon, Tarahumara Raramuri Indian has a new book out, an ethnobotanical book that's wonderful and was one of the really early leaders in Indigenous sciences. Certainly Robin Kimmerer, her incredible work. Elizabeth Hoover, her great work in food sovereignty and science. And justice. Gosh, there's many. Yeah, and I just finished co-editing a book that's out called What Kind of Ancestor Do You Want to Be? And it's multi-ethnic. There's a lot of different voices in it, but I edited the final section on lighting the seventh fire with Indigenous youth voices. And that's a really great collection. It includes mixed media too, which is more closely related, I think, to our Indigenous ways. Interviews with the elders, poetry, storytelling, lyrics to songs, as well as creative essay. So what kind of ancestor do you want to be is a great one. And then when I co-edited Traditional Ecological Knowledge, is a really great collection on Indigenous science issues. So thank you for asking. And we'll come up with a list and put it up on CIIS public programs page. And we have another question here from Angelina. Hi, Angelina. She's an archaeological student who has just applied to PhD programs. She's an Indigenous woman descendant from Apache and Yaqui ancestors, but sadly she's been disconnected from her roots in Mexico. It's extremely important to me to honor my ancestors, all Indigenous peoples, and work towards correcting false narratives about many Indigenous peoples. Oh, it's a long one. I related so strongly to your own struggles with resistance to our spiritual values and beliefs in academia. I'm a paleoethnobotanist. Ooh, gosh, what a great area. So I study Indigenous relationships with plants in an archaeological context in Mesoamerica. What would you advise for ways to better serve our Indigenous communities through our research in the Academy? How can I work to understand how I can better serve these communities in a field that has a strong history of oppression and exclusion of Indigenous voices? How can I go about asking these communities how I can best serve them? Thank you for your question, Angelina. Perfect for you, Jessica.
Yeah, I think that it's great that they acknowledge the history behind archaeology, especially given that a lot of the archaeological um, artifacts that they have access to are stolen artifacts, right? Especially stolen sacred artifacts. And I think that it's kind of like opening access to our indigenous communities to also be able to revitalize their own traditions. I can think of the codices and how, there were our ancient Oaxacan, indigenous Oaxacan writing and scriptures, but yet a lot of them were burned, or the ones that we currently have, we don't have access to them because a museum or archaeologists kind of own them, right? In that sense. And I think that opening that access, also being vulnerable with the community, asking them, how we can support. It's also when the community kind of critiques the field, don't take it personal, because they're not personally critiquing you, but they're critiquing the system in itself. And I think that's a great way to start. And I mean, clearly the person has great intentions because they're questioning how they can better serve the indigenous communities. And I think that it's being vulnerable, making sure that the community has access to a lot of their sacred items as well, and seeing how we can, you can better serve them as well by asking them. That's a great way to do that.
Yes, great question, great answer. Yes, and I would just add that your field is so important right now with climate change, because paleoethnobotany, you can look at pollen samples from long ago and see how trees have changed, species have migrated, temperatures have risen or fallen, certain insects, couldn't pollinate anymore or could. I mean, there's so much ecology and environmental history and climate change data that can be harvested from that kind of work done in an ethical and good way at the direction of the local Indigenous peoples. So thank you for your work. Congratulations and good luck with your PhD. Oh my goodness. Where and how can I meet more Indigenous scientists, especially those who have a vision for how to fix the climate crisis? Well, you could come to the Ecological Society of America in Montreal in August, where we have a big group. It's still called Traditional Ecological Knowledge because it's been around a long time, but it's a group of Indigenous scientists, mainly ecologists. And we have special symposia and lectures and workshops. And there's going to be a big effort around the conservation through reconciliation movement and the tribal parks and land back movement. So conferences, I would say, and also local community initiatives. What would you say, Jessica?
Yeah, I would like to reemphasize that Indigenous scientists don't necessarily have to have Western credentials. They can be our local elders, our local community members. So learning whose lands you're occupying and, Googling, what initiatives the local Indigenous communities are leading. I believe that every Indigenous person is an Indigenous scientist, and we do hold a lot of knowledge, and especially like ancestral knowledge that dates longer than Western science about our environments.
Exactly. Yes.
But I guess you can meet Indigenous peoples everywhere because we're everywhere. So that goes back to where you can meet Indigenous scientists everywhere you stand up.
Great. I love
Yeah.
that. I love that. That's wonderful. Yes, in the early part of my career as a graduate student and through the Cultural Conservancy, I was so fortunate to learn from and work with the California Indian Basket Weavers Association. And the women basket weavers were just they are such scientists. Their understanding of the plants and the water and the climate and the soil and the insects and the herbivores and everything. Yeah. So traditional cultural knowledge keepers, like you said, are everywhere. Yeah. Well, thank you for those great questions. And I think we're just about at time. And just thank you again. What a joy and pleasure to talk with you. And congratulations on your incredible book. And I know more and more people will read it and help change people's mind for the better and help us all heal our own backgrounds and our relationships to the First People and strengthen and uplift Indigenous peoples of our lands. So thank you.
You also for all the work that you have done and continue to do for,
Yeah.
bringing and uplifting Indigenous science. And thank you everyone for the questions and also for helping me answer some of the questions. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, good. And thank you, CIIS. And I think, Alex, you are going to come back on here and close us out. So good night, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We do hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded tonight, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this very same link and on our Facebook page. We're also going to feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at CIISpod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful evening.